I'm Effie. I'm exhausted, but it's time for my September reading wrap up. I'm going to try and give as much information as possible about the books in this video. There are a couple that I'm going to be kind of brief with for reasons that we'll get to when we're at those books, but I've just come back from a couple of days away visiting friends and I'm not quite 100% energy, so I'll try my best to make this video good. And honestly, there's some books I'm really excited to talk about in this video, so hopefully you enjoy. And you know, maybe this will actually be a shorter wrap up than historically I've done. So just because I know sometimes people want to go into books knowing literally nothing about them, including people's opinions, I will be chaptering this video, so if you need to skip ahead to the next book I'm talking about, just look in the progress bar for the chapters. So I'm just going to start with the first book that I finished in September and work all the way up to the final book I finished, obviously. I don't know if that is obvious. I don't know. Yes, my brain is mush. I apologise. So the first book that I finished in September was 10 Things That Never Happened by Alexis Hall. I was really excited to pick this up because I really enjoyed the London Calling series, that's boyfriend material and husband material, and this is a sibling series to the London Calling series, so there's a few gentle nods to Luke, and I can't remember if, oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of the love interest in the London Calling series, but like there's definitely a mention to Luke. I just can't remember if the other one's mentioned in this book, but they're very much like kind of like set in the same world, same orbit, but very independent from each other, if that makes sense. So this book follows Sam, who works for a bedding and bathroom store. Well, he's the manager of this particular store, and wow, my brain really isn't playing ball today. Sam and Jonathan. Sorry, like I say, this is going to be an interesting one because my brain is just like mush. You cannot remember anything this month. So we've got Sam, who's a absolute joy, and then we have Jonathan, who is a bit of a grump, and he owns the whole company that Sam runs a store for. So he calls Sam down to London to the flagship store because he doesn't like the way that Sam's running his store, and they get into a bit of an argument which results in Sam having a head injury, and kind of a series of miscommunications means that Jonathan thinks Sam's got a head injury and has no one to look after him. So Sam ends up moving in with Jonathan to try and kind of save his job and save his store. And it's a really cute romance as we see the two kind of thawing and falling in love. And I thought it was the absolute cutest. And yes, there was a third act breakup, but you knew exactly why a third act breakup was going to occur. I think it was handled really well. And as heartwarming as this book is, there's a moment of just pure emotional damage, or at least for me, it was emotional damage. Like, you receive hints throughout the book, but then when it came, it just had me absolutely sobbing and quite honestly, I love books that hurt me in that way. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm much more of a romance reader than I used to be. But, like, you can have a romance that also provides you with emotional damage. And I'm not meaning, like, a romance that doesn't have a happily ever after. I mean, like, you know, you can discuss tough topics, but also have the cute, fluffy romance, which I think this book delivered on. I also really enjoyed the epilogue, which is a callback to the nod that Jonathan has in Husband Material, and it was just so smart and funny, and I really enjoyed it. I think at some point, possibly, I'm going to try and read all of Alexis Hall's back catalogue, because I have a feeling that he may be one of my favourite authors, but I just want to get a flavour for all the books that he's written, basically. The next book that I read was Rule of Three by Sophie Snow. It was another romance. This one is a poly romance. A woman's just gotten out of an incredibly toxic relationship and she moves to New York and she forms a connection with both of her neighbours who happen to have a romantic history with one another. It's spicy, but it's also sweet. It's also really affirming in the way that it talks about the trauma that our main character has as a result of being in her toxic relationship. And I've also just found out that this book is going to be part of a series, so I'm incredibly excited because I absolutely adored this book. It was just as cute as I hoped it would be, and also pretty darn spicy. The next book that I read was All the Little Truths by Debra Webb. This is the third book in a series following a woman who is a lawyer, but she doesn't currently work as a lawyer. She works as like a research assistant for a law firm. And unfortunately, I don't know if this is the last book in the series following this woman, but I think this is the last time that I'm going to read one of the books in the series, because a lot of things stood out to me this time about why this series isn't really clicking for me. I enjoyed reading the second book most because there was a lot of questions about this woman's husband and what happened around his death and the secrets that he was keeping that I was actually surprised were revealed in book 2. I thought it was going to be more drawn out, so there wasn't that element of intrigue that I enjoyed in, I guess, the first and the second book. And through my experience of the previous books, I was less interested in the case that our main character is following and more in her personal backstory. But without that backstory, it was just really dry. Like, the case didn't intrigue me at all. And there was this thing that I'm not sure if it was meant to be really obvious, but essentially, like, something happens with one of the characters and they say a throwaway line, and immediately I was like, oh, okay, I know exactly what's going to go on here. And unfortunately, the story played out exactly as I expected, and this, like, event and throwaway line happened very near the start of the story. So it was almost like the book was playing catch up with what I already knew was going to happen. I also found the ending to be, like, a bit too drawn out. Like, it was as if the author hadn't honed her craft and didn't realise that you could kind of make this ending a bit more succinct and woven together. But I know this author's written over 100 books, so it didn't really make sense to me that it was so ham-fisted. The next book I read was Carla by Colin Walsh. It's following a group of friends who are kind of reflecting on one of their group who disappeared. I think it was about 15 years ago when they were all teenagers, and it's set in this kind of small town and everyone's a little bit interconnected. There's a lot of dodgy things that happen, and some people are more aware of the dodgy things than others. And then there's also something that kind of brings the past storyline and the present day storyline as almost one. I think this is the kind of book that if you go in not expecting it to be a mystery thriller, but more expecting it to be more of a lit fic where it's more character driven than plot driven, I think you'll get a lot more enjoyment out of it. I actually enjoyed it because, to be honest, it was one of the whole heap of arcs that I'm trying to clear through at the moment. So I went in with zero expectations. I didn't even remember what it was about. I just kind of picked it up and was like, okay, let's just vibe with it. And because I managed to get it on script, I listened to it as an audiobook. So I was able to kind of potter on and do other things at the same time. So all these different things meant that I found it an absolute vibe, actually, for it to be slow and gentle, and it was a good ride. I mean, I have a really hard time kind of analysing lit fic because I don't read a lot of it, but I will say that I enjoyed it, I guess, more than I expected, even though I didn't really have any expectations when I read this book, if that makes any sense at all. The next book that I finished, and this is one that I'm not going to say too much about because it's not out until January and it's a little bit early to be kind of talking about it. I believe I've already put a review on NetGalley, and my NetGalley is linked to my Goodreads. Not that I use Goodreads except for my NetGalley books, but if you do want to know a bit more about my thoughts on this book, you can kind of look on Goodreads. But it was Mislaid in Parts Half Known by Seanan McGuire. This is, I think it's book 9 in the Wayward Children series. What I'll say, to keep it brief, is it's my favourite Wayward Children novel to date and needed more dinosaurs. The next book that I read, and it's one of only 2 physical books on my list, and the other physical book's a library book, so I don't actually have it physically, but it's Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail by Ashley Herring Blake. This is one of the books from my self-destruct list. I was going to do an individual video kind of reviewing it, but the thing is I ended up not getting around to reviewing it quickly, so a lot of the thoughts that I had reading the book have kind of gone out of my head because my head is now floof. I very quickly realised why I loved Delilah Green Doesn't Care, and I got a lot of the same vibes from this. I absolutely love the character of Jordan, who is the love interest. I thought Astrid had a good amount of complexity, and it was good to see her start to deal with things. I think where this book didn't quite live up to my expectations is I felt like a lot of the things could have gone further. I felt like Astrid could have had more explorations. I thought there was a moment where it was almost hinting that Astrid would kind of explore gender, because there's a moment where the characters are introducing themselves and exchange pronouns, which is fantastic, and Astrid says something like she uses she her pronouns. She doesn't, like, why would she use anything else? And I felt like that was hinting towards perhaps Astrid having a journey where by the end she'd feel more like a she they. But I clearly just read way too much into that line, but because of that, it meant that this book didn't quite go far enough. And then, whilst not actually related to this story, there's an extract for the third book in this series, Iris Kelly Doesn't Date, right at the end of the book. And I'll be honest, it actually made me the opposite of excited about it. So that left a bit of a bitter taste. You know, like, it's not to do with this book, but when your final impression is of the next book and the next book doesn't sound like something that is going to interest you, it's going to create a poor lasting impression. Like, it makes it sound like I'm really down on this book, and actually I had a great journey, but because it's been a few weeks and my lasting impression was of something that doesn't appeal to me, I guess I'm not that positive. But like, overall it is really cute. Like, annoyingly there's a third act breakup, but you kind of get why. These two characters work really well together. They're very cute, and I think the writing is pretty solid. The other thing is that I noticed a few mistakes that should have been picked up by an editor, like just a handful. But I think especially with like traditionally published books, like obviously with arcs, it's, you know, you overlook them in arcs because they are not final copies. And then with indie pub books, obviously like smaller budgets and stuff, but this is a traditionally published book, so to have mistakes that I can pick up when I'm just casually reading, not reading in any kind of critical way, just annoys me, I guess. The next book that I read, and again I'm going to be quite brief with this one just because it's not long come out and I've already got 2 videos on it. I've got a spoiler-free Just Vibes reading vlog, and I've also got a full almost 30-minute review where like I do go into spoilers, and that is The Fragile Threads of Power by V. Schwab. This was my most anticipated book for 2023 and I loved it. It lived up to my expectations, and that's all I'm going to say about it. But yeah, absolutely loved it. The next book that I finished was Inside Black Mirror by Charlie Brooker, Annabel Jones and Jason Arnopp. It's a series of interviews and it goes into depth about each episode of Black Mirror for, I think it's the first 4 seasons, and it was just really interesting to see behind the episodes and as well sort of how they came up with the tech. Charlie Brooker is incredibly funny. Like, beyond Black Mirror, which I first watched in 2011, or at least I believe I first watched in 2011. Beyond that, I used to really enjoy watching Screen Wipe and Wipe of the Year, I think it was called. I'm not sure how many years it happened for, but like, I enjoy Charlie Brooker's work in general. So it was quite nice to see that his humour and his sort of deadpan, socially awkward level of humour really translated onto the page, and it was just absolutely hilarious. In addition to those main contributors, there were different people involved in the interviews for each of the episodes. So sometimes you had directors, sometimes you had actors, you had members of the creative team, you had, I think, people from Netflix and people from Channel 4. You had a wide variety of people that gave you a lot of insight, and I do think it added value to my experience of Black Mirror, especially as someone who is a massive fan. And it just made me want to go back and do a complete rewatch of Black Mirror. The next book that I finished was Her Royal Highness by AJ Arnold. Just popping in here because since I recorded this video, I've discovered that this book has been pulled from release due to some pretty valid criticism that it has received. So I'm keeping my review in just for completeness, but know that this book is no longer being released and there is some criticism of the book that I wasn't aware of at the time of recording, which is why I don't touch on it here. This follows a violinist who runs a charity in Brooklyn who gets papped in a position that makes the world think that she's engaged to a Prince of England who happens to be having to become the king. It's a little bit of a silly concept, but then a lot of books that involve the British royal family are a bit of a silly concept. It's a silly institution as a whole. But, you know, the main character is very much like coded as Prince Harry. Like, he's not called Harry, but he's coded as him. There were a couple of awkward moments where, like, it was quite clear that the author was not British, in that one of the characters is called Andrew. And yeah, that's awkward. There was also another smaller moment where the main character, the one who's Harry coded, was said to be less popular than the Duke of York, who is the UK's favourite royal, and I cringed so much. For those outside of the UK or those who are unaware, the Duke of York, I don't know if that title's been stripped from him, but the Duke of York is Prince Andrew's title. So again, very awkward. But overall, it was, you know, a sweet, silly, fun time. I think the author was very aware of the fact that in order for the couple to be together, they'd have to make massive sacrifices. And that was kind of written into the story. And it felt like there was a lot of compromise. And it was very cute. It was very much a love conquers all story. And at the end, I found out it's going to be a series, although I'm not sure how I feel about it because we already know what the pairing for the next book is. And it's Prince Andrew. Yeah, because he is a prince now because he's no longer king. Yeah, so it's Prince Andrew and a character that I absolutely adored. So don't know if I'll be reading that one, because even though I know that that character is not the real life person, it's not something I really want to read. But overall, great time was had with this book. The next book that I finished was Vampire Menstrual Syndrome, the first cycle by S.C. Hunter. This book, every time I describe this book to someone, they're like, what on earth? But it is fantastic, like, considering I read it in the same month as The Fragile Threads of Power. I don't know what my favourite book of September is. I just had such a good time with it. So the premise, and this is where I lose everyone, but the premise is that a woman gets accidentally turned into a vampire on the first day of her period. And because it's accidental, like, her sire's nowhere around, and she very quickly has to figure out how being a vampire works, what's going on, because there's a whole supernatural undercity. And I don't know, like, there's a lot going on, but there's also not a lot going on. Like, it takes place over 7 days, and the book is somewhere between 475 pages and 750 pages, depending on if you're reading the digital or the physical edition. So it's a chunk of a book, but it's also, it doesn't feel its length. Like, for this book being such a long book, it doesn't feel like it's dragging. It's always got stuff going on. You know, you fall in love with these characters. It's unapologetically queer. I'm pretty sure there are no straight characters in this book, which feels so authentic to the way that queer people tend to find their people. There are also a number of people who use they them pronouns, but it's done in a very casual, not making a song and dance of it. It's just that some characters are referred to using they them pronouns. Some characters use he him, some characters use she her. It's just, it is, and there never has to be a discussion. Not that I would have any kind of issue with, you know, a character being like, actually, I would like these pronouns, but it's very nice to see an almost normalised approach where it's not a song and a dance. And I love that. There's also just a deeply feminist message under it all, because this is a world where vampires are not even allowed to drink from women, and obviously that is a deeply sexist and transphobic thing, and that is constantly being challenged in the text. And I'm so excited to see where the story goes, because this is going to be a trilogy, and the ending, so bloody satisfying. The next thing that I finished was books 0.5, 1 and 1.5 in the Lyonesse series by Simone. This is a retelling of Tristan and Isolde, but in very Sierra Simone fashion. It is incredibly spicy, it is incredibly kinky. So book 0.5, as you might gather, is a prequel, and it follows the characters of Mark and Isolde as they first meet. And then 1 is kind of Mark and Tristan's story, but also Tristan does meet Isolde in book 1. And then 1.5 is a short story that takes place, I believe, around chapter 18 of book 1, and it's between Tristan and Mark. So essentially this is, I don't know what the final dynamic is going to be. I have some suspicions about what the dynamic will be, but I don't 100% know. But Mark is a dom who runs a private kink club in Washington, and rather than people paying in money to be a member of this club, they pay in information. And obviously he has a lot of very important people's information, so that makes him an incredibly interesting character. And I think he's going to have like quite a lot of a dark backstory. Like, we haven't really gotten to see much of his story, but we've gotten hints that he can be incredibly callous, does not mind killing people, you know, is just such a dark character. But also he's written in a really compelling way. And then Mark is, and this is where it gets a bit dicey in my opinion, but also is true to the original story, so I don't know. So Tristan is Mark's nephew, but he's his nephew through marriage, so there's no blood. Like, what is it? Tristan's sister married Mark's father, but like when they were both adults. So like Tristan was like a fully formed adult before his father married Mark's sister. I think that's how it worked. So yeah, they're technically related, and he starts working for Mark as a bodyguard and discovers some things about himself and Mark. But yeah, I absolutely love Sierra Simone's writing so much. This is a sister series to one of my favourite romances of all time, and that's New Camelot series. One thing I will note is you can read book 0.5 and you can read book 1.5 without having read the New Camelot series. You will get slightly more out of book 0.5 if you have read New Camelot, but like you can read those without being spoiled. But book 1 has like such a massive spoiler for something that happens in the New Camelot series that I would never advise someone who has any intention of ever reading the New Camelot series to read the Lyonesse series before they read New Camelot. But I'm so looking forward to the rest of the books coming out in this series, because I had such a good time, and they live rent free in my head, and the fact that they're queer, and also whilst I don't have any faith of my own, I really appreciate that the characters are Catholic and queer, and they never feel like there's a conflict between the two. They are very comfortable in their identity as a whole. And the final couple of books that I read in September were 2 books from the Trapped with a Monster series by L.E. Eldridge, and they are Snowed In with a Demon and Washed Away with a Kraken. They have the most beautiful covers, and overall the stories are a lot of fun. I don't think I'd read a monster romance until I read these 2, and they actually were a lot more fun than I expected them to be. I mean, having not read a monster romance, I didn't have that much expectation, but I had a really good time with them. I loved that there was no third act breakup, and the romances felt cute and organic, but I do have a very big issue with them, and that's that the author slips between third person and first person, and like this is like within the same paragraph, so it's not like it's a deliberate change of POV. There's just, it'll be in one and then it'll be in another, and it was really jarring and would take me out of the story because it would just slip from one to the other. I think there were also spelling mistakes. You know, I can't remember, but the change in POVs was definitely something that made me sad, because these are otherwise really good books, but it was almost like I was having to mentally recalibrate when these slips happened, and they weren't just like one here and there. They happen quite frequently, so that was a shame, but I would still recommend them. Just be aware that these books haven't been edited to the extent that they probably should have been, and especially considering the author runs an editing firm. But they're a good time. Just be aware they are a bit rough around the edges. And those are the 15, I believe it's 15 books that I finished in the month of September. I'd love to know about the books you read in September, so maybe comment down below your best and worst of the month. I think overall I had a pretty decent month. Like, looking at my list, I'm not sure if I can easily identify what my worst book of the month was. But thank you for watching. Until next time, love you. Bye.